Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour podcast with your host, Andrew Langer.
Well, hey there, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire's Lunch Hour podcast. I'm Andrew Langer, your host. So glad you can join us today. If you are watching us on our YouTube channel, go and check us out wherever you get your fine audio podcast content. And if you're listening to us on one of those audio podcast channels, you can always see what's happening in studio by coming and visiting our YouTube channel. You should be following us on X. I know I still call it Twitter, but everybody else calls it X. At the Lunch Hour Pod on X is where you go to check that out. You can get clips. You can see, anyway, the latest news, what's going on. Also at Federal Newswire, if you're not following that. I was literally extolling to my guest how thrilled I am to have him on today. You all know that I love talking to innovators, and I love the intersection of innovation and public policy, innovation and regulatory policy. His name is Weifeng Zhong, Dr. Zhong. If I'm pronouncing it correctly, Dr. Zhong, am I?
Yes, you are. Thank you for having me, Andrew.
You're welcome. So he is a native of China. He serves as senior advisor to the America First Policy Institute's Office of Fiscal and Regulatory Analysis, where I'm sure he works with and knows some of our former guests as well. He has over a decade of experience applying data analytics and artificial intelligence to policy questions. He is a co-creator of the Policy Change Index. This is what I'm thrilled to talk about. An open source project that uses AI to analyze and predict government actions based on their words. And in a matter of just 5 years, the PCI project grew from a two-programmer playground to a suite of software tools that have informed U.S. and allied government agencies, the private sector, and the academia about the behavior of authoritarian regimes like China and Russia. He's got some really interesting stuff out now about North Korea. We're going to talk to him about that. He has a PhD in managerial economics and strategy from Northwestern, and before joining AFPI, he was at the American Enterprise Institute and the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. He's got a Substack, which I'm going to ask him to promote towards the end of the interview. And let's start here, Dr. Zhong, with, what drove you to do this? Actually, there's so many questions. You can tell I've got a farrago of questions that I'm about to ask. But are we now at a moment where AI can do things that we only dreamed about in terms of its predictability? And how did you get on the cutting edge of this? What made you think, something, I wonder if I can use AI modeling to start to predict the behavior of authoritarian regimes?
Yeah, what you were mentioning, Andrew, is the Policy Change Index project was something I did even before the cutting edge happened, the large language models. It was just language models back in the days in the
small language models.
Which now has a different meaning too. But so
of course
I started to work on that project because, well, I need to tell you the story about when I first
left. Tell the story and get deep in the weeds.
I need to tell you that when I first left mainland China for the very first time of my life, it was after I finished college. I went to Hong Kong for my master's degree. And I learned about the Tiananmen Square massacre when I finally left mainland China and arrived in Hong Kong. And that was a whopping 17 years after the fact. I saw a sculpture that's to commemorate the death, the people who died on Tiananmen Square, and I was like, what the heck?
Right.
Who died? What are you talking about?
Right.
Because I was in the dark, right? I was growing up in mainland China. I was watching propaganda growing up on TV and the newspapers, and nobody told me about Tiananmen Square massacre. And that's when it occurred to me that, media and propaganda has a very strong persuasive power and information control.
100%.
And so that put me on the journey of, I said to myself, one of these days I'm going to study propaganda coming up from the CCP. And which is exactly what I did in the year 2015 when I was first hired out of graduate school to AEI. My boss was now the NEC chair, Kevin Hassett, but he was at AEI at the time.
Sure.
And he told me just, you got a few years here and do whatever the heck you wanted. Maybe in a little bit more polite language, but that's basically the the job discussion. So I thought,
He wanted you to play jazz. That's what he wanted you to do. Play jazz with the public policy, which is a great way to get people invested. Anyway, go ahead.
That was like anybody's dream, everybody's dream job, right? Is to be able to do whatever you're most passionate about. So I spent 3 years there. That was just when NVIDIA was starting to sell their GPUs, when people were starting to build neural network, like machine learning models. So I picked up all those skills by harvesting every single word that ever came out of the CCP's mouthpiece since 1946, which is even before we have the People's Republic of China. And so I harvested all these millions of words coming through the official newspapers, and I started to mine what's inside. And what it turns out that the CCP is actually pretty transparent about what they were going to do, because they kept all these talking points, and they tried to move the public so that the public would go with them on whatever evil journey that they have in mind, right? So you need to move the people. And it turns out that also applies to Russia, it applies to North Korea, basically applies to every powerful mouthpiece, because if you control the mouthpiece, Andrew, you would use your words very carefully to move the people, right?
And it demonstrates, right, the concept, right? We all know I believe it's Mao, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step, right? When you look at some of the political divisions here in America and where they come from, and sort of the roots of the two very distinct viewpoints that Americans have in terms of politics and who we are as a people, it has its roots. I was just talking about this to somebody yesterday about Khrushchev's famous speech to the UN, in which he said, "We will be at your funeral." It was widely. I have a Russian studies degree. And he's normally widely reported as "We will bury you." It really was "We will be at your funeral," telegraphing to us all what the intention of the USSR and the Comintern in terms of changing the face of Western civilization generally, but specifically in the United States. And if you're not paying attention, right, these things happen over time. It's very subtle. You have to pay attention, don't you, Dr. Zhong?
Absolutely. So I think fundamentally, which is why I think a big reason why I'm a conservative in this country, is that I think the communism is an extreme form of a lot of the liberal ideas we have in this country. Because
interesting,
the CCPs, so the guiding principle of the CCP and the Soviet Union was actually that people are stupid. The Communist Party is, righteous, and it knows where we need to go as a nation, as a people. So the government is here to help, and so it became the entire nation was basically a nanny nation, and which is it's a more extreme form of some of the nanny state ideas that we have on parts of this country as well.
It's funny, because I when I talk about my journey in terms of politics, I came to my free market limited government beliefs by first being an ardent anti-communism, and it's all ardent anti-communist, and it's funny because it all stems from. Have you ever seen the movie Red Dawn? The original Red Dawn?
I have not.
Oh, it's worth a watch. I was talking to a colleague of mine about this who'd also have never seen it, and he's working on an anti-communism project. And it is a story about the U.S. Being invaded by the Russians and their Central American allies in the 1980s. And a lot of my friends came to their conservative values through this. It's ironic that when the movie was remade a few years later, communist China was originally the enemy, and then the Chinese government insisted, because they were so ardently financially backing Hollywood, that they insisted that it be changed to North Korea. Anyway, that's a massive digression there, as though North Korea has the wherewithal to invade the United States. But let's talk about how this works and what it does in terms of predicting. Let's talk about Russia and China, and then eventually I want to talk about North Korea. But talk to us about what it does.
You mean the propaganda?
No, the PCI. Let's get into it.
Yeah. So it basically monitor the stream of content coming out from very tightly controlled media outlets, and then it monitors every time it deviates from itself. So
Interesting.
we don't care about whether it's talking about truth, because none of that is truth anyway.
Yep.
It's all, fake news, right? The real fake news is
Right.
is the propaganda coming out from CCP and
Sure.
the authoritarian regimes in general. But we monitor every time it deviates from this baseline, and that's usually is a good signal for the behavior that's coming up.
Interesting. Can you give me some examples? Because I'm fascinated by this.
So the best example I would give is actually during the Second World War, when
Okay.
intelligence analysts in the US and the UK, they were basically monitoring radio broadcasts coming out from the Nazi regime, which is because it's on the radio, right? Because it's nothing is supposed to be secret, because it's what they would talk about to the people. But it turns out that there are traces in the language coming out from the radio broadcast that sort of deviates from its baseline. And it turns out to be a very good predictor of even the launch time of secret German weapons. It somehow just shows in the tone and tenor of Joseph Goebbels.
Okay. And so it can, some of this can be tough, right? We know how hard it can be to read into a text message, a bare bones text message, the tone of somebody. But this is a pretty good, I guess, is it, how do you generate from tone, or is it just simply deviating from the standard message that you can determine these things?
Yeah. So it's deviation from what that same outlet used to be doing things. So one way to think about it is, what do you prioritize, right? So as an outlet, you put something on the front page, you put something on the second page, above the fold, below the fold. That's your way of prioritizing content. Now, what we do is to say, well, is that behavior of cherry picking what goes on the front page of the newspaper, has that particular decision shifted over time? So if you used to talk about, thing A above the fold, now all of a sudden you talk about thing B above the fold, then it means that you care about thing B much more so than you used to care about thing A.
Of course, yes. That makes sense, right? I mean, it's a signal. I mean, this is, especially since we're relying so much more on open source intelligence, more so than, we always relied on it to an extent. But there was a much greater reliance, or there's been a shift, because there is so much more information that comes out and is available. This becomes invaluable. So let's talk about it. We'll move away from China, and I do want to talk about North Korea, as I said, but let's talk about Russia. And let's talk about Russia specifically, since you've been doing this research, since 2014, 2015. Russia, well, I don't know, has Russia become more emboldened? Are these the things that you were able to predict and see? I'm talking about moving from invading Crimea to, full-scale predation elsewhere in Ukraine. And then actually, were you able to chart changes in regimes, and I don't mean that in a negative way, but changes in presidencies, leadership here in the United States, and how Russia reacted to that? Any indications there?
Yeah, so for Russia, because of the quality of data is a little actually poor than the context in China and North Korea, because it has a little bit of media freedom, because you have different, the media outlets are not as centralized as what it used to be in the Soviet Union. So what we saw more was actually noisier than the context of China and North Korea. But what we were able to, for example, detect change in language leading up to invading Ukraine in a way that's similar to when it was leading up to taking Crimea. So there's this type of language coming out before action. It's actually a pretty common phenomenon.
Right, but no indication in anything these days of potential off ramps in terms of the Ukraine Russia conflict, right? We're not sort of seeing. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's actually a harder problem. I've been trying to work on that, think through that. It's if you think about conflicts that are less severe, like trade war, for example, right? Or any other type of negotiations, when two sides are in an impasse, whether they will come off of the ramp and reach an agreement, it's not necessarily something that will show up in the language. So going into might be something different from coming out of, which is something I still haven't quite fully figured out. If you look at the trade deals between the U.S. and China, there was not really much significant signals in the media from either side before they reached the phase one. We're talking about like something like 8 years ago.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, so I was just going to say that this is predicting the ending might be fundamentally a different problem than predicting the beginning.
But this is really about sort of, understanding greater the how past behavior sort of gives signals to sort of the current thought processes and sort of what we can learn. I mean, let's turn our attention to North Korea because you just launched the policy change index for North Korea. By the way, you've got a great Substack, Way to Think Again, WEI, Way to Think Again.com. But let's talk about that. I mean, again, listen, nothing better. I got to tell you, you ever want to get stirred up, pumped up, just watch a North Korean news air quotes, news broadcast to get yourself pumped up, because Lord knows that'll get you pumped up. But you've now applied this to North Korea. What have we learned? What are we learning?
So we did exactly the same thing as what we did on China for North Korea. We monitor their Rodong Sinmun is the North Korea's version of Pravda. It's essentially controlled the most prominent newspaper of the Workers' Party there. And what we found was before Kim Jong-un shot something major up the sky, there were some changes in the language too. So you might think that this is actually crazy because he was going for surprises, right? It's just like Nazi Germany.
Sure.
They were trying to deploy these secret weapons. They did not mean to tell you ahead of time. But somehow, if you look closely in between the lines from their newspapers, you can detect some traces there too.
Yeah, it is fascinating. You just wrote a piece, how to understand North Korea, and what is it? Not risk. Sorry, here we go. And not risk your life to go there. I'm someone who's fascinated by. All right, I'm going to say this. My wife lived in South Korea for a year, and I went over to visit her. And what I loved about visiting South Korea was that there were things that were very similar to the United States, just a little different. I'm always fascinated by these disconnects, and I am fascinated by stories of folks who've gone over to visit Pyongyang, for instance, or North Korea generally, and how they call them Potemkin villages, right? They're the images, they're the fakes that try to make it look like a functioning society. But like a story about some big tech person going over and seeing banks of PC computers with no one using them. This is fascinating. The part of this is we don't want to have to risk our lives to go over to North Korea to have to better understand North Korea. So much of it is just out there. This is one of the benefits of the work that you're doing, isn't it?
Well, I certainly think of it that way. I went to North Korea before I built the algorithms. So had I built it, in time, I wouldn't have had to go there to see it myself.
Well, wait. I guess I missed this. So talk about that. When were you in North Korea? What was that like?
So that was 2010. I was right after my first year in my PhD. I passed that preliminary exams. It was like a huge relief. So I thought I would spend the summer to see something. And I always wanted to see what China used to look like before I was born, because I was born in the market reform era. And so everything I lived through is like going in the direction of capitalism until, much later.
Sure.
So I wanted to see what China was looked like before. And so my parents said to me, just go to North Korea. It's the same thing. I mean, maybe a little worse, but it's largely the same thing. So I took a trip to North Korea to see just how bad things were. Obviously, it was terrible. The people there were, terribly malnutritioned. And they try to show us the absolute best side of the country. It's a totally guided tour by who appear to be a spy of some sort. No surprise there either. But they very tightly control what we saw and just showed us the best of the country, which is still way worse than what I could randomly spot in South Korea.
Yeah, this is very similar. I visited the USSR in 1989. And again, Intourist Guide. I think we slipped away from the Intourist Guide once to go and tour a slum neighborhood in what was then Leningrad, now once again St. Petersburg. But yeah, I mean that is fascinating. It's funny. My Soviet studies advisor, because that's my undergraduate degree is in Soviet studies because there was still a Soviet Union to study. You all can do the math and figure out how old that makes me. She used to say that, whenever whenever one of the Kims would rattle sabers, it meant that they were running out of food and they were running out of bark to eat on the birch trees, but that's it. Let's take a step back because, guy that I work with, Jerry Rogers, he's the editor of Real Clear Policy and Real Clear Health. And he and I used to do it more frequently. We need to get back to doing it. One of the discussions that we would have on our old podcast was whether or not there was a fundamental misjudgment of the benefit of opening up these communist authoritarian nations to trade with Western nations, right? There was a conceit amongst the libertarian class. And again, this is not me taking a swipe at libertarians, but I think there was a conceit that simply by opening these things up to the free market, we would all of a sudden produce classical liberal Western style democratic republics. And that hasn't been the case, certainly. Can you talk about that? I mean, right, I brought over, genes to trade. I was there with Russia right after they opened up the first Pizza Hut. Pepsi was all over the place. What did we miss, especially vis-a-vis China, which should, by all measures, be a fully functioning Western liberal democracy now, but it's not. What did we miss?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, Andrew. And I wouldn't say that we misjudged China. I think we did. But even a lot of people back in China misjudged China's fate
Sure.
after joining the WTO. I remember when I graduated from college, just right before I left for Hong Kong, I got an award at the university. So the award ceremony, the guy who's giving me the award was the China's chief trade negotiator for the WTO accession.
Sure.
And I remember very distinctively, I was disappointed because there was this other guy next to me who's his award was handed over to him by a very famous mathematician. I was like, I like that guy. I don't like the trade negotiator to give me the award because the trade negotiator for China's accession to WTO was a very unpopular figure back in early 2000s. A lot of people thought that he sort of betrayed China's national interest. They gave up too much for China to join the WTO. But nevertheless, the Chinese people thought it's a good thing that we are joining the WTO because it will make us better. It will make us more open. It will make us more, become a more modern society. I think there's a lot of good intention back in the day, which is why that guy was not popular. And I only learned later on that China kind of realized they could take advantage of the WTO after joining. They could change the rule of the game. So instead of changing yourself to be better, you can corrupt the entire system and take even more advantage of it. So I think that's a huge learning experience for China. It's a surprise for everybody and it shows once again that economic freedom is not the same as political freedom, even though they are often thought of as going hand in hand.
Expand on that, because I'm a firm believer in Hernando de Soto. Hernando de Soto's work, both Hernando de Soto and Richard Pipes. Hernando de Soto's The Mystery of Capital and Richard Pipes' Property and Freedom literally changed my outlook. I mean, they're two seminal works, and they basically talk about the boom-bust cycles given how much a nation protects private property rights. And I've spent a lot of time talking about how private property rights undergird society, right? They essentially do two things, right? They both allow people to invest in themselves and have some reasonable expectation that they're going to get that gain. So they have the certainty they need to innovate, while at the same time in that investing in the future, there's a degree of hope and stability. There's a respect for that. China seems to throw a real wrench in those works, right? Or is it? I mean, is it that they they have the respect for intellectual property and innovation internally, provided that you don't run too far askew of what the CCP wants? I mean, is that a whole? It's a whole new model, isn't it? And then tell me if I'm right or wrong. I could be very
No,
wrong here.
you're absolutely right. I'm so glad you brought up Hernando de Soto because his book Mystery of Capital was one of them. Growing up in China, I have read a lot of forbidden books, and his book was one
Sure.
of them. And we yawn for the capitalist future, the idea of what's in
Right.
Hayek, what's in Mises, and all these great classical liberal books in China. And I read those books when China was relatively, getting a little bit more open. So it's a little bit more
Sure.
tolerant for kids, at school to read these kind of Western books. But there's a major difference there. So we always thought, Peru could do it. We could do it too in China. So that's a lot of people in China thought that way in the past. What China did was unusual because it kept autocracy and trying to pursue capitalism on the economic side. And what ends up, I think, happening is that, when we talk about market economy, we talk about protection of private property rights, deregulation, a lot of good economic policies. They need the regime to keep their hands off of the people.
Right.
And as an authoritarian regime, you just can't keep your hands off of the people.
Right.
And so I think that's what failed China in the end.
But is that is part of the fundamental difference here that because obviously I labor in the fields of regulation and regulatory impacts. If you don't care about the regulatory impacts, right, and everything else is just kind of serving the state, and you don't particularly care about waste and where the waste goes, right? If you're not trying to, I don't know, maybe in China they are trying to better maximize things. I don't think that they are. Or you don't care about wasting human capital, right? If you're essentially, if everybody becomes grist for the mill, is that how China is able to do it? Both, because the thing that surprises me, one of the things that I talk about, used to talk about quite a bit with regards to Russia, is you don't see a lot of innovation coming out of Russia, right? It's one of the other hallmarks of the authoritarianism is that it doesn't instill the idea to innovate. But China right now is engaging in major amounts of innovation. I think about the number of drug trials that have just exploded. And more to the point, the U.S. review of Chinese originating drug trials, that deeply concerns me. Is it all regulatory and human capital in nature, or what gives China, even with the social crediting system and with the other hallmarks of autocracy, what is it that allows China to have that level of innovation? Or is it just a large language model? Is it just the numbers game?
I think for the large part in since 1990s, maybe for 2 or 3 decades right there, that China made a lot of progress simply through catching up. And when you see the goalpost, I think my understanding is that when you have an authoritarian regime who really wants to make money, and you see where you need to go, because you can see the United States and Europe and England all the time, right? You know why they're so rich. You kind of have an idea of why market is good. So when you see the goalpost and you have a tight control of the society, you could catch up very quickly. So that made up 90% of the way to getting toward the frontier. So I just sort of a personal story was so I was born in the early 80s. So when I was a baby, like an infant, there was no milk in China, not where my parents could find or could afford. But then, when I was like maybe 3 or 5, we started to be able to afford eating meat, like maybe once a week, once a couple of weeks, and then you can have fish, right? And then you can have meat and fish and every day, and then you have a very bad diet. But initially, we couldn't afford anything. So the progress was amazing. And that's because in every step of the way, you're basically catching up to where other advanced nations are already there, so you could see where you're headed. I think now the authoritarian regime or the autocracies doesn't do very well is to explore new frontier. You could actually say the same to all the Chinese innovations. They're not really innovations in a sense. Not like groundbreaking. Like China did not come up with large language models before the US did, right? They were able to catch up better. They could make something like DeepSeek that's, pretty good. And the reason they are pretty
Yeah.
good is because they don't care about privacy, right? So China could
Right.
collect a lot of data.
Right.
They can disrespect the human life and human capital and rules and laws in society. So they can harvest a lot more data to train their algorithms, which might seem to perform better. But remember, that's not genuine innovation. Genuine innovation requires human freedom to think freely, to come up with ideas freely, and to implement them freely.
Got it. So we're not. I really appreciate it's a subtle point, but it's an important one. What might appear to be innovation, I mean, it gets into something that I long said, right? If you steal other people's intellectual property and you use slave labor to produce it, obviously you're going to rocket ahead economically. So this is just sort of a one-off on the data side, isn't it? I mean, really, it's not about stealing transistor radio tech and producing super cheap transistor radios or knockoff clothing. It's about the tech side of it. Listen, let me turn our attention a little bit elsewhere, because as I said, I talk about the regulatory issues. You're a senior advisor to America First Policy Institute's Office of Fiscal and Regulatory Analysis. Talk about the work that you're doing for OFRA. I mean, we've talked to other folks at AFPI about the regulatory side of it and the fiscal impacts of regulation, but talk about your role in all of this.
Yeah, so what I do with the team at AFPI, we call it OFRA, the OFRA. It's basically try to quantify, to measure everything that goes on in the U.S. government, especially fiscally, regulatorily, and relates to taxation, spending, regulations in various federal agencies. Our view is basically that the U.S. government, in terms of policy making, is like somebody who has a person who has had decades of very bad diet. Now you're overweight, you're a lot of burdens on your body. It's in very poor health. All that is destroying the economic potential of the country. We recently did a study that's coming out on our website very soon, is to measure, how things could have been, how differently things could have been if we kept regulation. Let's say if we kept regulation.
Wait a minute. Are you guys doing research on the regulatory glide path? Did Matt Jensen steal my idea? No, I don't mean that.
I know you talked to Matt.
Hold on for a second. I call this the regulatory glide path, right? What happens if we kept the cost of regulation constant over time? What are you guys are further quantifying the economic benefits here?
So this is relying on a paper did by Patrick McLaughlin, a regulatory expert, and his co-authors. We built.
I know Patrick well.
I worked with Patrick during my years at Mercatus, and we always have a lot of fun discussing.
Of course. Oh my God. Anyway, I'm sorry. Go ahead. This is guys. This is old timers day here at the podcast. Go ahead.
Absolutely. So he had this model that basically allows us to think about, to fantasize about what would have happened had we kept regulations at the level, say, 1980, right? So we're talking about almost half a century has passed.
Yes.
And we can measure, now we are putting out a new study that measures the money that could have been in American people's pocket by now. But we are not getting that. And that's close to over $400,000. So it's $500,000 at everybody's pocket. It's the money we have lost over the years.
It's one of those things that I was talking about this before the election last year. What it means if we continue to grow the regulatory state at 15% per year, what it means if we grow it at 0.33%, or in fact it slightly declined under Donald Trump's first term, and you're talking about the difference by 2030 of $4 trillion in direct regulatory costs. The great thing about Patrick and Matthew also, but Patrick says that the opportunity. Are you going to get into opportunity cost at all?
Yeah, so that's the opportunity cost. The opportunity cost is
of course.
we have wasted so much money, so we could have gotten that much money over the last 45 years.
So I know Patrick says that it's a $2 multiplier. I know Dawson and Cedar, if you sort of extrapolate from their 2012 paper, it's a $19 multiplier. Obviously, the truth is somewhere in the middle. Here's a question for you. I'll pose this to you. No one may have asked you this before, because I had a conversation a few weeks back with Ian Bannon, and I think it goes along with what you're saying here, right? Because I've long said that really the benefit of regulatory reform is that regulatory glide path, keeping things on a constant track. And Ian talked about the deregulation side of it, and he said one of the problems with trying to get to measure benefit out of deregulation and removing regulatory mandates is that so much has already been built into it, right? Businesses have already changed their behavior. And it's an interesting thing to think about. We'd like to think that if we cut this, we're going to produce massive economic benefit. It seems to me that we're all on the same page here, that really it's about constant. We recognize a $4 trillion regulatory state is much too high, or $2.5 trillion if you believe CEI. I think the numbers are closer to 4 trillion because that's my number. But obviously, $4 trillion out of an economy that's 25, 30 trillion dollars in size is massive. But if you just keep it on that glide path and you don't add, that's important, isn't it?
Yeah, so every little bit helps, but I think you're pointing out something very important, Andrew, is that change takes time.
Yes.
So we don't lose that half a million dollars per head like overnight.
Right.
It's over the last 47 years, right?
Right. It's accretion, yeah.
Yeah. So it's like now you have this super unhealthy person, and you try to put on a good diet on that person, right? It doesn't help you. It doesn't bring if you eat fries and more than you drink water every day, even if you change it, you become a vegan, the next day, it doesn't bring your probability of getting a heart attack down to zero. It takes time,
right?
But you had to continue. You had to stay on that healthy level for a long time to reap the benefit of a freer economy.
I lost almost 60 pounds last year, and I had to fundamentally change my diet to keep that. If you go back and you look at podcasts from when I started this thing and then last year, you'll see that. When is that paper coming out? And I want to do what I can to help promote that. Any idea when that's coming out?
I think it's any time now. It's probably in the next couple of days, a day, 2 days.
Patrick is doing some really great work on AI and comment drafting, which is just in terms of breaking down and analyzing things. I'm doing work on the role that AI can play in compliance assistance costs. Actually, I'll ask you. I'll throw another curveball out there, because I believe that we ought to be able to use AI to, if you're a small business owner, you should be able to plug in a few key pieces of information into a compliance portal on a federal website, and it should be able to spit out all of your regulatory obligations, along with plain, simple English language guides in terms of how to comply. It should give you all the paperwork. And I had a colleague of mine say to me, well, I don't really want that. I don't want to necessarily make it easier to comply, because that will send a subtle psychological message that the burden isn't all that high. What are your thoughts here on this? To me, the benefit is manifest. We got to, if we want people to comply with regulation, we got to make it easier to comply. But you're right, we don't want to make it easy to expand the regulatory state, do we?
I don't think we want that. I think there's obstacles to. There are many obstacles to deregulation, as you know very well.
Sure.
Part of that is also people who are in the game, who have already complied, and in the industry, they are reaping the benefits of being one of few, right? So those people who are in the industry operating might not want more competition from outsiders, and so they might not want the regulatory burden to become lighter either. And
right.
So there's so many obstacles to regulation. But my philosophy, and which is what we everybody on our team at AFPI is so excited about this project, is that we try to take the first step of trying to measure everything, so then we can have a clear idea of exactly what the government is doing to the economy, and that's the first step toward streamlining and simplifying for the American people. You think of, we're talking about the diet analogy. I didn't know you had your experience. I was thinking about my own diet.
Oh yeah,
problem.
no.
But the problem is you approach a problem like this. The first question you will ask a person is, hey, what have you been eating, right? We want to measure and every nutrition elements of your intake during the day, and then we figure out what's healthy and what's unhealthy, and what to do next. We are just at the start, at the beginning of doing the same for the U.S. government. There's so many regulations.
Yeah.
and so much burden that those regulations are imposing on the economy. We are just at the beginning of quantifying all of that. And if we are able to do that, we will have a much better handle about how to make government serve the people better, which is ultimately what we want in democracy anyway, right?
100%.
Right. I'm so glad you mentioned AI and technologies, because this is precisely what we are doing at the FBI. We try to leverage modern technologies to help us understand all these governmental burden.
Well, it really is. It's been an amazing process so far to watch, right? Which is this idea of we're going to start with reforming the bureaucracy, where we're going to take a look at where the accretion is in terms of the plaque that's building up in the arteries within the government itself. Then we're going to go and solicit for the regulated public, what they think, where they think the problems are. And then, we're seeing that now with all of these information collection requests and our requests for information from the agencies. And now we're also now starting to finally see, recommendations in terms of those changes in the form of, notices of proposed rulemaking and advanced notices of proposed rulemaking. So it's a process. Listen, before I let you go, I ask all of my guests this. So you're not only doing this work, obviously you have a life outside of this. I like to talk to my guests about some of their outside interests. When you're not crunching these big numbers and thinking about these big ideas, what are you up to? What are some of your outside non-policy oriented interests?
Non-policy. So I make fractal art. I don't know whether you're familiar with. So I use computer programming language to make artwork. And
that's amazing.
Sometimes I could make it such that the computer code on the screen look quite like the art that it would generate.
That's amazing. That is really cool. See, that is a first, right? I talked to, Larry Spywak at the Phoenix Center for Law and Economics. He plays harmonica, and somebody else is a photographer. But this is the first time I've had somebody say, yeah, I do digital fractal art. That is amazing. Let me ask you this before you, the part of China you're from, Shaoguan. Did I say that?
Yeah,
correct?
Shaoguan. Yeah.
So where is that in China? What's the sort of the local regional dish? What do you miss from home, if anything, in terms of food?
Oh, good question. So Shaoguan is part of Guangdong. Guangdong is right next to Hong Kong in the mainland.
All right.
On the mainland side, and in Guangdong we steam everything.
Okay.
And which is hugely important, because if you are steaming everything, you want your material to be really fresh.
Sure.
Because bad things, they show up when you steam them, right?
100%.
Which is what makes it so delicious. Is if you have fresh material, you just steam everything. Everything 100%. Is so nice.
Well, there you go. Well, Dr. Zhong, how do folks find out more about the good work that you're doing?
So you can go on AFPI website, AmericaFirstPolicy.com, to read about the work we do at the Office for Fiscal and Regulatory Analysis, on the PolicyChangeIndex.org.
Yeah.
You can also see my work on propaganda analysis as well.
Amazing. And Weifeng, Weifeng Zhong, Zhong on X, and the link to your Substack there. Go and give Matt Lester a big hug from me. Will you do that for me?
Absolutely. Thank you, Andrew.
I would tell you, listen, and I say this, I am incredibly envious about that you guys are doing this upcoming paper. I am thrilled. And I can't wait to help you guys promote that. Shout out to the high heavens, talk about it with everybody, because it is such vital work. Weifeng Zhong, thank you so very much. As we already said this. Listen, this has been yet another episode of the Federal Newswire's Lunch Hour podcast. Go and check us out on X at the Lunch Hour Pod. And you can also find me at Andrew_Langer on X as well. Please hit the subscribe button, leave a like, leave a comment, and let your friends and family members all know how much you've been enjoying the show. I'm Andrew Langer, your host. Please enjoy the rest of your lunch.
This has been the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour podcast, hosted by Andrew Langer. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream